Trapper spent decades hunting creatures in the Appalachian Mountains that most of the world refused to believe existed. He faced things in those woods that would have ended any other man's investigation before it started, and he went back every time. But in his final days, he said something about one investigation that he had never said about any other, that it scared him, that what the Ames team found during that hunt was something he was not prepared for. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what Trapper revealed changes everything. John Trapper Tice was not a man who frightened easily. That is not a characterization built from the edited version of him that Mountain Monsters presented to its audience across 8 seasons of television. It is a characterization built from the full body of evidence of how he lived, the decades of hunting and fieldwork in some of the most remote and unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States, the community relationships he maintained across generations of Appalachian families who trusted him with accounts of experiences they would never share with an outsider, and the operational culture he built within the Ames team that treated the phenomena they were hunting not as entertainment, but as a genuine and serious subject requiring genuine and serious investigation. Trapper grew up in the tradition of Appalachian mountain culture that understands the wilderness as a place inhabited by things that do not appear in any official catalog and that has never required outside validation for that understanding. The oral tradition of the region he operated in, the accounts passed down through families across generations describing creatures, presences, and phenomena in the mountains that defy the frameworks of mainstream biology and conventional experience, was not exotic folklore to Trapper. It was the informational context within which he had operated his entire adult life. He brought that context to Mountain Monsters, and it gave the show something that no production budget or network development process could manufacture. An investigator whose engagement with the subject was rooted in a relationship with the land and its people that predated cameras by several decades. The Ames team he assembled and led reflected that same quality. These were not paranormal television personalities recruited for their on-camera charisma. They were men with specific skills and specific backgrounds whose value to the investigation was practical rather than presentational. Trapper understood what each of them brought to the field and deployed those capabilities with the methodical deliberateness of someone who had been thinking about how to find these creatures long before anyone offered him a television show to do it. What made him exceptional as an investigator was not his willingness to go into dangerous terrain in the dark, though that willingness was genuine and documented across every season of the show. It was his ability to read the Appalachian landscape, the signs, the silences, the behavioral indicators that something significant had passed through an area or was currently present in it, with a fluency that came from a lifetime of immersion in that environment. He was not startled by the mountains. He was at home in them in a way that went beyond familiarity into something closer to belonging, which is why what he said about the investigation that scared him most carries a weight that nothing in the Mountain Monsters broadcast record approaches. A man who belonged to those mountains, who had spent decades in them encountering things that most people would find terrifying without ever describing himself as frightened, identified one investigation as the exception. That exception is what this video is about. The broadcast version of Mountain Monsters presented its investigations within a format that the paranormal television landscape had established. Dramatic music, night vision sequences, constructed traps that almost but never quite caught anything, and a tone that balanced genuine fieldwork with the entertainment requirements of cable television. That format served the show well commercially across 8 seasons and built a dedicated audience that followed the Ames team through the full range of Appalachian cryptid territory. What it did not fully convey was the nature of what the investigation was actually accumulating beneath the surface of the broadcast material. The Appalachian mountain range is one of the oldest geological formations on the North American continent and one of the most consistently documented regions in the history of American cryptid and paranormal encounter reports. The density of the forest, the isolation of the communities embedded within it, and the cultural tradition of those communities, which has never treated anomalous experience as something requiring outside confirmation before it can be considered real, has produced a body of encounter testimony that stretches back further than any other comparable region in the country. Trapper understood this body of testimony not as a catalog of claims to be investigated, but as an accumulated record of observation from people who had been living alongside whatever inhabits those mountains for generations. The Ames team's investigations were, in this framing, not discovery operations. They were documentation operations. They were going into terrain where the local population already knew something was there, and attempting to produce evidence of sufficient quality to bring that knowledge into a form that the outside world could engage with. That distinction matters for understanding what the investigation that scared Trapper most actually produced. The show had documented compelling evidence across multiple seasons, physical signs of large unknown creatures, eyewitness accounts from credible local sources, audio recordings of vocalizations that did not match any known animal in the regional wildlife catalog. None of it had crossed the specific threshold that Trapper maintained in his own private assessment of the investigation's finding, the threshold between evidence that pointed towards something and evidence that confirmed it. The investigation he identified in his final days as the one that scared him most was the investigation that crossed that threshold, not because it produced better physical evidence than prior investigations, though what the cameras documented during that investigation exceeded anything the show had previously captured, but because of what the evidence implied about the nature of what the Ames team had been hunting across all the prior seasons, and what that thing's relationship to the human communities living in its territory actually was. To understand why the investigation Trapper identified as his most frightening encounter matters beyond its immediate evidence. It is necessary to understand the broader tradition within which the Ames team was operating, the Appalachian cultural and historical context that informed Trapper's understanding of what lived in those mountains and what its presence meant for the people who shared that territory with it. The Appalachian mountain communities that Mountain Monsters drew its witness testimony from are not communities that discovered the creatures they described through the show's investigation process. They are communities that have maintained continuous awareness of those creatures across generations of coexistence that has not always been peaceful, and that has produced a body of transmitted knowledge about the behavior, the capabilities, and the boundaries of the beings that inhabit the deep mountain terrain alongside the human population. That transmitted knowledge takes different forms in different communities. Some of it is embedded in the hunting and land use traditions of families that have worked specific sections of mountain territory for generations, knowledge about which areas are avoided, which times of year bring increased signs of non-human presence, and what behaviors indicate that the boundary between the human and non-human territories is being approached or crossed. Some of it exists in the religious and spiritual frameworks that Appalachian mountain culture has developed across its history, frameworks that treat the presence of powerful non-human beings in the wilderness as a theological reality rather than a folkloric tradition, and that have specific doctrinal positions about the nature of those beings and the appropriate human relationship to them. Trapper was embedded in this tradition in a way that shaped every operational decision the Ames team made in the field, the locations he chose to investigate, the local sources he consulted before entering new territory, and the behavioral lines he established for the team during active hunts all reflected a knowledge base that went significantly deeper than anything the broadcast episodes made visible. The investigation he identified in his final days as his most frightening experience was frightening in part because of what it produced on camera, but it was frightening in larger part because of how what it produced on camera aligned with specific elements of the Appalachian traditional knowledge that Trapper had been carrying for decades, elements that he had hoped, across all the prior investigations, would not be confirmed in the direct and unambiguous form the evidence from that hunt produced. He had spent his career operating in the knowledge that the mountains contained something extraordinary. The investigation that scared him most was the one that told him specifically what that something was, and the answer aligned with the most serious and consequential interpretation of the Appalachian tradition, not the folkloric edge of it, but the theological core. The investigation Trapper identified as the most frightening of his career did not begin with any indication that it would end differently from the dozens of hunts the Ames team had conducted across the prior seasons. The location was in territory the team knew, a section of Appalachian mountain terrain that had generated consistent reports of anomalous creature activity across an extended period, and that had produced credible witness testimony from local sources whose relationship with Trapper gave their accounts a weight that anonymous reports would not have carried. The decision to investigate that specific location at that specific time was driven by an escalation in the reported activity that Trapper's local contacts had been describing over the preceding months, an escalation that was unusual not in the category of phenomenon being reported, but in its frequency and its proximity to the areas of human habitation at the edge of the deep mountain territory where the activity was normally concentrated. Something had moved closer. Whatever had been operating in the deep terrain of that mountain section was generating signs of its presence in areas it had not previously occupied, and the people living nearest to those areas were communicating a level of concern that Trapper took seriously. precisely because these were not people who communicated concern about mountain phenomena casually. The Ames team entered the investigation location in the early evening with their standard equipment configuration and the expectation that the elevated activity reports would translate into a productive investigation night. What they encountered within the first 2 hours exceeded the preliminary assessment of the location's activity level in ways that the team's prior experience in comparable terrain had not fully prepared them for. The signs of recent presence in the investigation area were not the ambiguous indicators that require expert interpretation to identify as significant. They were immediate and unmistakable, physical evidence of something large operating in the area within a time frame that placed its presence in the investigation zone concurrent with the team's arrival. The forest behavior was the first indicator that registered across the full team simultaneously. The ambient sound environment of a mountain forest at night is one that every member of the Ames team had extensive experience reading. The baseline of insect, bird, and small animal activity that provides a continuous acoustic map of what is and is not present in the surrounding terrain. That baseline shut down within 30 minutes of the team's entry into the investigation area in a pattern that Trapper later described as the most complete and rapid cessation of ambient sound he had experienced in decades of mountain fieldwork, not a gradual thinning of background noise as the team's presence registered with the wildlife in the surrounding area, a simultaneous and total shutdown that covered a radius of forest significantly larger than the team's immediate position, the kind of acoustic displacement that indicates the presence of something that the local wildlife recognizes as a predator of sufficient significance to trigger a unified silence response across multiple species at once. The footage from the investigation that Trapper identified as his most frightening experience documents a sequence of events across approximately 4 hours of active fieldwork that the Mountain Monsters production had never captured in any comparable form across the prior seasons of the show. The opening phase of the investigation footage is consistent with what the broadcast episodes had established as the show's standard field documentation. The team moving through the investigation area, calling out observations, responding to instrument readings, and establishing the baseline evidence picture before the active phase of the hunt began. What the cameras began capturing in the second hour of the investigation is where the footage diverges from anything in the show's prior record. The first significant moment documented on camera occurs without any dramatic buildup or visible trigger. A sudden and complete reorientation of every member of the Ames team toward the same direction simultaneously, without verbal communication between them, in response to something the audio track captures in the infrasound range below the threshold of comfortable human hearing. The team's physical response to that sound, the stiffening of posture, the immediate halt of all movement, the particular quality of stillness that experienced mountain hunters adopt when they have registered a predator stimulus, is visible on camera without any of the standard Mountain Monsters' dramatic framing around it. This was not a television reaction. The cameras then captured what happened when the team advanced toward the source of the infrasound. In the tree line approximately 80 yards from the team's position, movement became visible across multiple camera feeds simultaneously. Not the movement of a single entity passing through the frame, but a pattern of movement that indicated multiple presences repositioning in the dark timber in a coordinated manner that the team's experienced hunters recognized immediately as deliberate rather than incidental. What those multiple presences did over the following 90 minutes, the coordinated movement, the vocalizations that the audio equipment captured with a clarity and a complexity that exceeded anything the show had previously recorded, and the specific behavioral pattern that Trapper later described as the detail that frightened him most, is documented on camera in a form that left no member of the team with any ambiguity about what they were experiencing. The broadcast audience saw a version of that night. What they saw was not the version the cameras captured. Across 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters and decades of fieldwork in the Appalachian Mountains before the show existed, Trapper had developed a working understanding of the behavioral boundaries that defined his relationship with whatever inhabited the deep mountain territory his team investigated. Those boundaries had held across every prior investigation, an implicit negotiation between the human presence of the Ames team and the non-human presence of the creatures they were hunting, in which both parties maintained a specific distance that neither crossed without the investigation reaching a natural conclusion. The moment Trapper identified in his final days as the moment that frightened him most was the moment during the investigation documented in this video when that boundary was crossed. Not by the Ames team advancing further into the territory of whatever they were hunting. By whatever they were hunting, advancing into theirs. The cameras documented the moment the coordinated presences in the tree line began moving toward the team's position, rather than maintaining the parallel tracking behavior they had been exhibiting across the prior portion of the investigation. Trapper's response to that movement, visible on camera before any verbal communication between team members, was the response of a man whose decades of experience in those mountains had just told him something that his prior experience had not prepared him to process in real time. He had spent years operating on the understanding that the creatures the Ames team hunted were aware of the human investigators in their territory, were capable of monitoring and responding to that presence with a sophistication that went beyond animal instinct, and maintained a consistent behavioral pattern of avoidance that kept the investigations within a range of danger his experience could account for. What advanced out of that tree line toward the team's position that night was not behaving within that pattern, and what Trapper saw in the quality of that advance, in the deliberateness of it, the patience of it, and the specific directional intention it communicated, was the detail he referenced in his final days as the thing he could never fully set aside after that investigation was over. It was not the size of what came toward them, it was not the speed, it was the intelligence the advance communicated, an intelligence that understood exactly what the Ames team was, exactly what their equipment was capable of documenting, and exactly how close it could come before the investigation would break. It came to that line, and it held there, and it looked at Trapper with the full weight of something that had been in those mountains long before any human institution had been keeping records about what lived there. He never said what looked back at him from the dark, but in his final days he said that whatever it was, it knew him, and that it had known him for longer than he had known it. The question of why Trapper maintained silence about the investigation that scared him most across the years between when it occurred and his final days is not a simple one. The simplest component of the answer is the one that applies to any person operating within a television production framework. The contractual and institutional constraints that govern what cast members of a cable television show can and cannot say publicly about their experiences on that show and the evidence those experiences produced. Those constraints were real, and Trapper operated within them as every Mountain Monsters cast member did. But contractual constraint alone does not account for the specific character of the silence Trapper maintained about this investigation. He was not a man who found silence easy when he believed something important needed to be said, and across his public life he had demonstrated a willingness to push against institutional boundaries when the subject matter was significant enough to justify it. The silence about this investigation was different in character from the ordinary professional discretion he applied to the show's unreleased material. It was a silence that the people closest to him during the final years of his life have described as deliberate in a way that went beyond network compliance. A decision he had made about this specific investigation that was rooted not in contractual obligation, but in a personal reckoning with what the investigation had produced and what saying it publicly would mean. Part of that reckoning was theological. Trapper's relationship to the Appalachian religious tradition, the specific framework within which the communities he worked with understood the presence of powerful non-human beings in the mountain territory, had been shaped by a lifetime of encounter with evidence that pushed against the boundaries of what that framework could comfortably contain. The investigation that scared him most had pushed through those boundaries in a way that forced a personal confrontation with the most serious implications of what he believed about the nature of the things he had spent his career hunting. He was not ready to say those implications out loud for most of the years that followed the investigation. What changed in his final days was the same thing that changes the calculation for anyone approaching the end of their life about what they can afford to leave unsaid. The professional consequences of speaking no longer carried the weight they had. The personal reckoning he had been conducting privately about what the investigation meant and what it implied about the nature of the beings the Ames team had encountered across all the prior seasons had reached a conclusion, and the people he trusted most, the individuals who were present with him in those final days and who have shared his words in the time since, heard him say what he had spent years deciding how to say. He said it was real. He said it was not an animal. He said what came toward them that night in the tree line knew exactly what it was doing. And he said that the thing that frightened him most was not what it was. It was that it had always been there, and it had always known they were coming, and it had been deciding for a very long time how close it was willing to let them get. Buck has never talked about this investigation, not in interviews, not on social media, not in any public appearance since the night it happened, The Ames team has faced creatures, physical attacks, and terrain that would have ended most people, and Buck has talked about all of it. The silence around this one investigation is different. It is deliberate, it is maintained, and now it is over. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what Buck just revealed about what the Mountain Monsters team encountered changes everything about what is living in those Appalachian mountains. Jacob Lowe came on to Mountain Monsters as the youngest member of the Ames team, the rookie whose combination of fearlessness and inexperience made him both the most entertaining and the most genuinely useful person in the field during the early seasons of the show. The nickname Buck was earned, not assigned. It came from the way he moved through the Appalachian backcountry, headstrong, direct, without the calculated hesitation that years of fieldwork in dangerous terrain tends to build into experienced outdoorsmen. Where Trapper would assess, where Jeff Headley would research, where Huckleberry and Wild Bill would position and prepare, Buck would go. Into the dark hollow, into the flooded cave, into whatever the investigation had identified as the most active and the most dangerous point in the area, and had consequently decided needed a human presence first. That willingness was not performance. Anyone who has watched enough Mountain Monsters to know the difference between a cast member playing a role and a cast member doing what they would do whether the cameras were running or not, knows that Buck's forward movement in the field is authentic. He is genuinely the person who goes first. Trapper recognized that quality before the show existed, before the Ames team had a camera crew following it through the West Virginia backcountry, back when the three co-founders, Trapper, Jeff Headley, and Willie McQuillian, were building the operation that the television production would eventually document. He brought Buck in because the investigations needed someone whose instinct in the field was advance rather than assess. Across the show's run, Buck grew into something more than the team's forward element. After Trapper's health began declining and the weight of the Ames team's leadership shifted, it was Buck who absorbed the most significant portion of that weight. He became the team's center of gravity in the field in a way that Trapper's illness made necessary and that Buck's development across the prior seasons had made possible. The man who speaks now about the investigation nobody was allowed to see is not the rookie who charged into dark spaces because he did not know better. He is the man who became the team's leader by following Trapper's example long enough to understand what that example was actually teaching. His silence about this investigation until now has been the most deliberate silence in a career that has been defined by the absence of hesitation. Whatever he held back about what the Ames team encountered during that investigation was held back for reasons that the person who has never held anything back in those mountains decided were serious enough to override everything that defines how he operates. Those reasons are what he has now decided the world is ready to hear. The Ames team has investigated creatures across the full stretch of the Appalachian mountain system from West Virginia south through Kentucky, Ohio, and North Carolina, and back again across 8 seasons of documented fieldwork. The specific terrain of each investigation shapes what the team encounters and how it encounters it. The deep, hollow systems of the southern West Virginia coal fields produce a different class of experience from the ridge systems of the eastern counties, and the river drainage hollows of Pleasants County, where the team is based, produce different encounters again from the remote plateau country further south and east. The location of the investigation that Buck has never discussed until now is in West Virginia, not a distant location that required the production to travel to, not a region the team approached as outsiders, but home terrain. The specific hollow where the investigation took place is within the geographic range that the Ames team has been working across the full history of their operation, in country that Trapper knew from decades of hunting and that Willie McQuillian understood from a lifetime of working timber in the same drainage systems. That familiarity is significant context. The team did not encounter what this investigation produced because they were in unfamiliar territory operating without the local knowledge that their West Virginia roots give them in the areas they know best. They encountered it in the kind of terrain that their combined experience should have given them every advantage in. The hollow had been flagged in the team's research files for a period of time before the investigation was mounted, not as a primary target for a full investigation deployment, but as a location that kept producing witness accounts, whose specific characteristics placed them in a category that the team's prior fieldwork had established as warranting direct investigation eventually. The accounts were consistent in a way that the team had learned to distinguish from the generalized strangeness reports that the mountain communities produce continuously, and that the investigation filters out from the accounts that indicate something specific enough to pursue. Something in that hollow had been producing consistent, specific, behaviorally detailed accounts for long enough that the team had moved it up the priority list and assigned Jeffro to compile a comprehensive research brief on the location's history before any field deployment was planned. Jeff Headley's role in the Ames team operation is the one that the show's format has consistently underserved relative to its actual importance. The investigation sessions that the cameras follow into the field are the visible portion of an operation whose invisible portion, the witness interviews, the historical research, the folklore documentation, and the pattern analysis that Jeffro assembles before any field deployment, determines the quality of what the field work produces. His antique and trading background, his deep familiarity with the material culture and oral history of West Virginia's river communities, and the decades he spent building relationships with the kind of rural informants who know things about the Appalachian backcountry that never enter any written record, give his research process a reach that no academic methodology could replicate. What Jeffro assembled on the hollow in question before the investigation was mounted is the foundation on which understanding what the team encountered there rests. The location's documented history extended back further than anyone on the team had anticipated when the initial accounts were flagged. The research brief that Jeffro produced connected the hollow to a pattern of reported activity in that drainage system that predated living memory. Accounts from the grandparents and great-grandparents of current community members that were consistent with the current witness reports in their behavioral descriptions without any mechanism for the kind of cultural transmission that would produce artificial consistency through repetition. The specific behaviors documented in the oldest accounts, the territorial marking, the structured vocalization patterns, the apparent awareness of human activity in the hollow at distances that should have been beyond detection, appeared in the current accounts without the community witnesses being aware of the prior documentation. That independence across temporal distance is the kind of evidential quality that Jeffro's research training recognizes immediately as significant. Something had been active in that hollow across a span of time that the witness record established as generational, not visiting, not passing through, resident. The research brief also surfaced something that shifted the tone of the team's pre-investigation discussions in a direction that Buck has described in his recent disclosures as unlike any prior planning session he participated in. Among the historical accounts Jeffro documented was a series of reports from timber workers who had operated in the hollow during the mid-20th century, workers whose professional experience in the West Virginia backcountry gave their assessments a credibility baseline that the research brief treated as significant. Several of those accounts described not a creature, but a presence, something in the hollow that did not produce consistent visual encounters, but that the workers independently and consistently described as felt rather than seen, something that the hollow knew about them before they knew about it. Willie McQuillian has built traps in the West Virginia backcountry for longer than most of the Ames team has been alive. His knowledge of the terrain, the timber, and the behavioral patterns of whatever the investigations are targeting gives his trap designs a functional sophistication that his materials, salvaged junkyard components, locally sourced timber, traditional fastening techniques learned from decades of working wood in the mountain environment, do not immediately communicate to anyone who has not seen what those traps can hold. He does not talk much about his process. He never has. His on-screen communication about what he is building and why tends toward the practical and the immediate rather than the reflective or the analytical. When Willie says something is different, it is because the materials or the terrain or the behavioral intelligence the trap needs to account for is presenting him with a problem that his accumulated experience has not previously solved. The trap construction for the hollow investigation was different from the first day of the build. Buck has described Willie's demeanor during the construction process as the quietest he had been across the entire period Buck had known him. And Buck has known Willie since before the show existed, since Trapper first brought the team together in the same West Virginia backcountry communities where all of them grew up. The quiet was not the ordinary focused silence of a craftsman working a complex problem. It was something that Buck recognized from the field, the specific kind of quiet that experienced outdoorsmen produce when the environment they are working in has communicated something to them that they are still processing. Willie had scouted the trap construction site in the hollow before the build began. What he encountered during that scouting visit has not been fully disclosed in Buck's recent account. What Buck has said about it is that Willie came back from the hollow that morning and sat in the truck for longer than usual before joining the team to begin the build, and that when he did join them, The first thing he said was that whatever they were building the trap to hold, the trap needed to be stronger than anything he had built before. The first night investigation in the Hollow produced evidence that the Ames team's most experienced members responded to with the kind of controlled professional attention that distinguishes a team whose collective fieldwork has given them a reference framework for what the Appalachian backcountry produces from a team that is encountering everything for the first time. Huckleberry positioned the team with the spatial awareness of a Marine who has spent decades applying military tactical thinking to backcountry investigation. Wild Bill read the terrain's approach corridors and wind patterns with the tracking instincts of a man who served 6 years in the Corps and spent the subsequent decades developing those instincts in civilian fieldwork across the full range of the West Virginia mountain system. The evidence that the cameras picked up in the Hollow that first night was not subtle. The thermal hits that the investigation's cameras logged at the tree line were consistent across multiple camera angles and consistent with something significantly larger than any known wildlife species whose range includes that section of the West Virginia backcountry. The vocalizations that the audio equipment captured were structured in a way that Wild Bill, whose tracking experience includes an extensive acoustic reference for every wildlife species active in this terrain, identified as outside the range of anything in his knowledge base. The physical evidence documented in the soft ground of the Hollow's creek drainage was extensive enough that Jeffro spent most of the first night's session documenting it rather than participating in the active investigation. The track density and the distribution pattern across the creek bank suggested to him that whatever was active in the Hollow was not alone and had been using the drainage as a regular travel corridor for an extended period. But the detail from the first night that Buck has emphasized most in his disclosures about the investigation is none of those things. It is the detail that the cameras documented and that none of the team discussed during the first night session or at the debrief that followed it. Wild Bill noticed it first. He said nothing about it until the team had returned to the vehicles and the cameras had stopped rolling. What he had noticed, and what every other member of the team confirmed they had also noticed without saying anything, was that from the moment they entered the Hollow until the moment they left it, not one of them had heard a single sound from any bird, insect, or small mammal in the surrounding forest. For the entire duration of the first night session, the biological community of that Hollow had gone completely and absolutely silent. The second night in the Hollow was when the investigation moved from the extraordinary into the territory that Buck has spent the years since the filming session deciding how to talk about. The trap Willie had built was positioned and tested. The team was deployed with the coverage that Huckleberry's tactical planning had designed for the approach corridors the first night's evidence had established as most active. The cameras were running across multiple positions with the overlapping coverage that the investigation's most significant field sessions required. Everything that the Ames team's accumulated operational experience had produced across 8 seasons of documented field work was deployed in that Hollow on the second night. What happened during the first 2 hours of that session was consistent with the first night's evidence: thermal signatures at the tree line, vocalizations that the audio equipment captured at the infrasound boundary, physical disturbance in the creek drainage consistent with something moving through it at the opposite end of the Hollow from the team's position. The Hollow's biological silence was present again from the moment the team entered. Then the 2-hour mark passed and something changed in the character of what the Hollow was producing. Buck has described the change in terms that reflect the precision of a man who has spent his adult life developing the observational vocabulary to articulate what the Appalachian backcountry communicates to the people working in it. It was not a new sound. It was not a new thermal signature. It was a quality of attention that the Hollow directed at the team's position that had not been present during the first night or the first 2 hours of the second night. Something in that Hollow had made a decision. The shift from ambient presence to directed attention is a distinction that anyone who has spent serious time hunting in the West Virginia backcountry recognizes the moment it occurs. The moment when the relationship between the hunter and the terrain reverses, and the terrain begins hunting back. Every member of the Ames team felt it simultaneously. Nobody said anything, and then the cameras picked up what produced it. The sequence the Mountain Monsters cameras captured during the second night's investigation in the Hollow is the footage that the production reviewed and removed from the broadcast pipeline before any episode was assembled from the session material. Buck's account of what the cameras documented is the first public description of the contents of that footage from anyone connected to the production or the Ames team. He has been specific in his description in a way that reflects both his understanding that the footage exists and his awareness that his account needs to be consistent with what the cameras actually recorded. What the thermal cameras picked up at the 2-hour and 17-minute mark of the second night session was not one signature. It was several, distributed across the hollow in positions that Huckleberry's tactical assessment of the footage has subsequently identified as coordinated, not animals moving independently through shared territory. A deliberate arrangement of positions around the team's location that reflected an awareness of where every member of the Ames team was standing, what their coverage angles were, and where the gaps in that coverage were located. The positioning was tactical. That word is Huckleberry's. A retired Marine whose professional training was in exactly this kind of spatial awareness and coverage assessment looked at the distribution of thermal signatures in that hollow and used the word tactical to describe what he was looking at. The individual signatures that the cameras resolved at close range during the relevant sequence are what Buck has been most careful about in his disclosure, not because he is uncertain about what the cameras documented, but because he is aware of how the description sounds outside of the context of standing in that hollow at 2 in the morning with those cameras running and those signatures present. What he has said is that the dimensions were wrong, not larger than expected, wrong. The proportions visible in the thermal resolution at close range did not correspond to any biological reference that the team's collective decades of West Virginia backcountry experience had established, and the behavior of the signatures during the relevant sequence, the stillness, the patience, the quality of deliberate assessment that every member of the team present that night has independently described as the dominant characteristic of what the cameras documented, was the behavior of something that had done this before, many times, and had never once been documented doing it until those cameras caught it in that hollow on that specific night. The Mountain Monsters production reviewed the hollow investigation footage and made the determination to pull it from the broadcast pipeline before the episode was assembled. Buck's account of how that decision was communicated to the Ames team is one of the most revealing elements of his disclosure, because the manner of the communication tells a specific story about the level of the organizational structure at which the decision was made and the nature of the concerns that drove it. The team was not consulted. The footage review that produced the pull decision was conducted within the production without the Ames team's involvement, and the communication to the team was not a discussion or a collaborative editorial conversation. It was an instruction. Buck has described receiving that instruction with a directness that reflects both his personal response to being told that the most significant investigation the team had conducted was going to disappear into a production archive and his understanding of what the speed and the totality of the pull decision communicated about why it was made. Productions pull content for reasons that range from the legally cautious to the editorially considered. The Ames team has been associated with a show that has always operated at the edge of what its network was willing to broadcast. The series has never been shy about putting genuinely dangerous and genuinely anomalous content in front of its audience. The decision to pull this specific footage entirely, without any attempt to edit it into a broadcastable form, without any consultation with the team that produced it, and with an instruction to treat the investigation as though it had never occurred, is not consistent with any ordinary editorial concern. It is consistent with footage that everyone who reviewed it understood immediately could not be shaped into a form that the broadcast format could contain. Wild Bill, whose response to the pull decision Buck has described as the most direct of any team members, put it plainly in the private team discussion that followed. He said that whoever reviewed that footage and decided to pull it did so because they knew exactly what was in it, and they pulled it because they knew exactly what showing it would mean. Trapper built the Ames team around a simple conviction that what the Appalachian Mountains contained was real, was significant, and deserved to be pursued with the seriousness and the skill that the terrain and the subject demanded. He spent his life in those mountains. He led the team through investigations that took them to the edge of what any of them were prepared to encounter, and he never once suggested that the edge was a reason to stop. Buck inherited that conviction the way the youngest member of a team inherits everything the older ones built, not through instruction but through proximity, through watching someone do the thing they believed in with total commitment across every season of the show until the body that had carried him through a Vietnam combat deployment and 32 years of Union boilermaking work finally gave out. What Buck is revealing about the hollow investigation is the thing Trapper would have put on camera without hesitation. He would have sat in front of that footage and described every frame of it and let the audience make of it what they would. That is what the show was always supposed to be. The investigation nobody was allowed to see produced the most significant evidence the Ames team has ever gathered in those mountains. The footage exists. The team knows what it shows. And Jacob Lowe, Buck, has decided that the silence Trapper would never have maintained is a silence he is no longer willing to maintain on Trapper's behalf. Whatever came out of that hollow on the second night and arranged itself around the team's position in the dark is still in those mountains. It was there before the Ames team was formed, It will be there long after the last camera is packed away. Buck just made sure it can no longer be there alone. Mountain Monsters ran for 8 seasons and produced one of the most loyal audiences in paranormal television history. Then it was canceled. The official explanation was the kind of vague, institutional non-answer that networks provide when the real explanation is something they have decided the audience does not need to know. What the official explanation left out is what this video documents in full. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because the real reason Mountain Monsters was canceled changes everything about what the show was. When Mountain Monsters ended its run on Travel Channel, the official communication about the cancellation was the specific kind of non-communication that the cable television industry produces when it has decided that the audience's relationship to the show it is canceling does not entitle that audience to a complete account of the decision. There was no formal announcement, no network statement whose specific language addressed the question of why a franchise with 8 seasons of production history and one of the most demonstrably loyal audience bases in the paranormal television genre's history was being concluded rather than continued. There was the absence of a renewal, the specific silence of an institution that has made a decision it does not intend to defend publicly, a silence whose character communicates something specific about the nature of the decision it is managing. The Mountain Monsters audience noticed, not immediately, the gap between the end of the show's broadcast run and the community's full recognition that the absence of renewal represented a permanent conclusion rather than a production hiatus produced a period of uncertainty whose resolution the network's silence did nothing to accelerate. But eventually the recognition arrived. Mountain Monsters was canceled. The official explanation, to the extent that the network's silence constitutes an explanation, attributed the cancellation to the ordinary commercial considerations that the cable television industry applies to programming decisions: ratings, audience demographics, the competitive landscape of the paranormal documentary genre whose proliferation across the cable television space had increased the competitive pressure on individual franchise performances. These explanations are not false. They are incomplete. They are the portion of the complete explanation that the network was willing to put in the public domain, the commercially defensible account of a decision whose complete motivation the official communication was specifically designed not to fully represent. What the official explanation left out is what the investigation this video documents has been able to establish through the accounts of people whose proximity to the production and the network relationship during the show's final seasons gave them knowledge of the complete picture that the public record does not contain. The Mountain Monsters production during its final seasons was operating in a context whose specific character the broadcast episode's continued entertainment presentation did not reflect, and that the people closest to the production during that period have described in accounts whose consistency establishes a picture of the show's final chapter that the official cancellation narrative has never incorporated. The most significant element of that context was Trapper's health. John Richard Tice's physical condition in the period leading up to his death on December 16, 2019, had been deteriorating across a timeline whose relationship to the production's final seasons is more directly relevant to understanding the cancellation than the official explanation has acknowledged. The production was aware of Trapper's health situation. The network was aware of it. And the specific question that awareness produced for both the production and the network, the question of what Mountain Monsters was without the personality whose presence was the show's most essential and most irreplaceable element, was a question whose answer neither party was eager to address publicly during the period when the show's continuation was still being managed as an ongoing operation. Mountain Monsters without Trapper was a different show, not a worse show in every dimension. Buck's leadership potential, Huckleberry's steady presence, Wild Bill's tracking expertise, and the collective personality of the Ames team were genuine assets whose individual value was real independent of the framework that Trapper's leadership provided for them, but a categorically different show in the specific sense that what the audience's loyalty had been built around, the specific quality of Trapper's authority, humor, and mountain wisdom, was not something that the production's existing cast could replicate through any reconfiguration of the format. The network understood that, the production understood it, and the specific calculation that understanding produced about the show's commercial prospects in the post-Trapper landscape and about the audience's relationship to a Mountain Monsters whose organizing personality was gone is the element of the cancellation's complete motivation that the official explanation was most specifically designed not to address. Travel Channel's relationship to mountain monsters across the show's broadcast history was never the straightforward commercial partnership whose surface appearance the production's continued renewal across 8 seasons suggested. The network's investment in the franchise was real. 8 seasons of production represent a sustained commitment whose commercial logic the audience's demonstrated loyalty provided a basis for. But the specific character of the network's relationship to what the show was, to the specific combination of regional authenticity, paranormal investigation format, and ensemble personality that mountain monsters represented, had been evolving across the show's run in ways that the broadcast episode's continued production did not fully reflect. Travel Channel's programming strategy during the final seasons of Mountain Monsters' broadcast run was shifting in a direction whose specific character was not entirely compatible with what Mountain Monsters represented as a franchise. The network was moving toward a paranormal programming identity whose production values, presentation style, and audience demographic targeting were more aligned with the higher budget, more dramatically produced paranormal franchises that were performing strongly in the competitive landscape of the mid to late cable paranormal genre. Mountain Monsters was not that kind of show. Its appeal was built on the specific authenticity of its cast and the specific regional character of its investigation environment. Qualities whose commercial value the audience's loyalty demonstrated, but whose relationship to the network's evolving programming identity was becoming more complicated as the network's strategic direction developed. The question of whether Mountain Monsters' format and identity were compatible with where Travel Channel was going as a network, and whether the investment required to continue the production was justified by the commercial returns in a competitive landscape that the network's strategic priorities were orienting toward different kinds of paranormal content, was the question that the network's cancellation decision was answering without stating. The Mountain Monsters investigation record from the show's final seasons contains findings whose specific character contributed to the network's assessment of the show's future in ways that the official cancellation narrative has not addressed. The show's investigation format had been evolving across its seasons in a direction whose endpoint the final seasons were approaching, a direction whose character reflected the accumulated investigation experience of the Ames team and the specific deepening of the investigation's engagement with the Appalachian phenomenon that sustained field work in the most evidentially active areas of their investigation territory had been producing. The evidence the investigations were generating in the final seasons was more significant in its character than the broadcast episode's entertainment presentation fully represented. Not in the dramatic sense of more extreme creature encounters. The show's creature hunt format had always prioritized dramatic presentation over evidentiary precision in ways that the Ames team's genuine field experience sometimes chafed against. In the specific sense of a body of accumulated investigation evidence whose implications for the show's central premise, the existence of the creatures the investigation was pursuing, had been building toward a point that the ongoing search format the show's commercial framework depended on was increasingly struggling to contain. When an investigation show gets close enough to its subject that the distance between the dramatic tension of ongoing search and the resolution of confirmed discovery narrows to the point where the format's commercial premise is at risk, the institutional response is rarely to broadcast the discovery. It is to manage the distance. Travel Channel's ability to manage that distance in the Mountain Monsters context was complicated by the specific character of the Ames team's investigation methodology, the practical, on-the-ground field approach, whose results were produced by genuine fieldwork, rather than by the controlled production environment that more scripted paranormal formats use to manage the relationship between investigation findings and broadcast content. The team was finding things. The network was managing what the audience was shown of those things, and the sustainability of that management in the final seasons, given the investigation's momentum and given the specific evidence the final seasons were producing, was a calculation whose outcome the cancellation decision reflects. The Mountain Monsters broadcast record contains within its episode history a pattern whose specific character, the distribution of the show's most significant investigation sessions across its seasons, the editorial decisions that shaped how those sessions were presented to the audience, and the specific gaps between what the broadcast record contains and what the complete investigation archive is known to contain, points at the real reason for the cancellation in a way that the official explanation's commercial rationale does not. The show's most evidentially significant investigation sessions were concentrated in the later seasons, the period when the Ames team's accumulated field experience and their deepening knowledge of the most active investigation territories in their Appalachian range had given them the capability to access areas and to produce evidence of a quality that the earlier seasons' less experienced experienced field approach had not achieved. The broadcast presentation of those later season investigations shows an editorial pattern whose character is consistent with the management of evidence whose complete representation would have exceeded the ongoing search format's capacity to contain it. Investigation sessions that the production's field documentation indicates produced significant findings are presented in broadcast form, whose relationship to what the complete session footage contained reflects the specific editorial compression that significant evidence management produces. The coverage of active investigation periods in summary narration rather than direct documentation, the reference to findings without the full presentation of what those findings consisted of, and the specific quality of the broadcast episode's most significant investigation moments feeling abbreviated in a way that the show's prior handling of comparable investigation sessions did not produce. The pattern is not conclusive on its own, but its consistency across the final seasons, the concentration of editorially compressed investigation presentations in the period when the Ames team's investigation capability was at its most developed, is consistent with the picture of a production whose most significant findings were being managed by the network's editorial process rather than fully broadcast, and whose cancellation reflected in part the network's assessment that the management was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The accounts of people whose proximity to the Mountain Monsters production and to the network relationship during the show's final seasons gave them knowledge of the complete picture that the official explanation does not contain are the most direct evidence available of what the official explanation left out. Those accounts are not fully in the public record. The professional and personal relationships that the people with the most direct knowledge maintain with the production and with the network create constraints on full public disclosure that the accounts available reflect. But what has been communicated in the partial, carefully worded accounts that people with direct knowledge provide when they are willing to speak about what the official explanation omitted is enough to establish the character of what the complete picture contains. The production personnel whose involvement in the final seasons gave them direct knowledge of the network relationship during that period have described a quality of institutional discomfort with the direction the investigation was taking that the straightforward commercial rationale of the official explanation does not account for. The discomfort was not about the show's performance metrics. The audience loyalty that Mountain Monsters had built across 8 seasons was demonstrable, and the network's awareness of it was reflected in the continued renewal that preceded the cancellation. It was about something more specific, about the character of what the investigation was producing in its final seasons, and about the network's assessment of what continuing to broadcast that production would eventually require the editorial process to manage in a way that the network had decided was not compatible with its programming objectives. The Ames team members whose public communications about the cancellation have been the most substantive, whose accounts of the show's conclusion have gone furthest toward the complete explanation while remaining within the constraints of their ongoing professional and personal relationships to the production, have described the cancellation in terms that are consistent with the picture of a network that had made a decision about the show's future based on considerations that the official commercial rationale does not fully represent. What those considerations were is what the following section of this video addresses directly. John Richard Tice's death on December 16, 2019 occurred within the timeline of the Mountain Monsters cancellation decision in a way whose specific relationship to that decision the official explanation has never addressed. The cancellation did not occur because of Trapper's death. The network's assessment of the show's future was already in process before the death occurred and was shaped by the complete picture of the show's situation during its final seasons, rather than by a single event whose timing the production could not have predicted. But Trapper's death confirmed something about the cancellation decision that the official explanation's commercial rationale leaves implicit rather than stating that the network's assessment of what Mountain Monsters was without its most essential personality was the foundation of a decision whose commercial logic the audience's loyalty alone was not sufficient to override. The specific question that the network's assessment had been building toward across the final seasons, the question of what Mountain Monsters was as a franchise in the absence of the personality whose presence defined its most fundamental appeal, was answered definitively by Trapper's death in a way that removed the ambiguity that the ongoing production context had maintained. Whatever the network's cancellation decision had been based on before December 16, 2019, the death of the show's organizing personality transformed the decision's context From a commercial calculation about a franchise whose future was uncertain into a confirmation of what the calculation had established. Mountain Monsters without Trapper was a different show. The network had already decided that the different show was not what they were going to continue investing in. Trapper's death made that decision's foundation visible in a way that the official explanation's vague commercial rationale had been designed to avoid making visible. And the combination of what the official explanation left out, the investigation evidence management, the network's strategic direction, the production's awareness of Trapper's health situation, and the specific calculation about the show's post-Trapper viability, is the complete account of why Mountain Monsters was really canceled that the audience that built 8 seasons of loyalty to the Ames team has never been given. The Mountain Monsters. Ames team members' public communications about the show's cancellation are a study in the specific art of saying something significant while remaining within the constraints of what professional relationships and personal loyalties permit to be said fully. Buck, Huckleberry, Wild Bill, Jeffro, and Willie have each made public communications about the show's conclusion, whose specific content, what they say, how they say it, and most significantly what the consistent gaps in their accounts indicate about what they are choosing not to say, points at the complete explanation in a way that the official account does not. Buck's public communications about the cancellation have been the most substantive of the cast members' accounts, reflecting his position as the team's post-Trapper leader and his understanding that the audience's investment in the Ames team entitles them to more than the network's institutional non-answer. What he has said about the cancellation describes a decision-making process whose character was more complicated than the commercial rationale suggests, without fully characterizing the nature of the complication. The specific language he uses, the careful distinctions between what the network decided and what the team understood about why the decision was made, the references to the show's investigation producing things that the broadcast format was not always equipped to contain, and the specific quality of resignation in his communications about the conclusion, is the language of a man who understands more about the complete explanation than his professional relationships permit him to state plainly. The other team members' communications are more constrained and more consistent in their restraint, reflecting the specific position of people whose relationship to the production and to the network was more bounded than Buck's leadership role created, and whose public statements about the cancellation reflect those boundaries. What the combined communications of the Ames team members establish about the real reason, not through what they say but through the consistent shape of what they do not say, is a picture whose outline is clear enough to read even in the absence of the direct statement that none of them has made. The real reason Mountain Monsters was canceled, the complete account whose assembly from the available evidence this video has constructed across its preceding sections, changes the show's legacy in a specific and consequential way. It changes the cancellation from the story of a franchise that ran its commercial course in a competitive television landscape into the story of a production whose investigation was getting close enough to something real that the institutional framework around it made a decision about what continuing to broadcast that investigation would eventually require. That distinction matters for the audience that built 8 seasons of loyalty to the Ames team because it changes what 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters represents. If the show was canceled for the commercial reasons the official explanation suggests, the broadcast record is the complete record, the full account of what the investigation produced across its run. If the show was canceled for the reasons the complete explanation establishes, the broadcast record is the managed fraction of a complete investigation record whose most significant findings the network's editorial process was containing in the final seasons, and whose continued containment the cancellation made permanent. The Ames team members who have continued their investigation work through the Sons of Appalachia channel, who have gone back into the Appalachian Mountains without the broadcast infrastructure, and without the network relationship and without Trapper, are doing something whose significance the complete explanation of the cancellation makes more legible than the official account permits. They are continuing an investigation that the institutional framework around Mountain Monsters decided to stop, not because the investigation had run out of territory to cover or evidence to find, because the investigation had been finding things whose continued documentation the institutional framework had assessed as something it was not willing to continue supporting. Buck and Huckleberry and Wild Bill are in those mountains without travel channel and without the production infrastructure and without the man who built everything. They are finding things. The findings are not being managed by a network's editorial process, and whatever the Appalachian Mountains produce for the Sons of Appalachia operation, whatever the investigation that Mountain Monsters was really canceled for approaching continues to produce in the men who have refused to stop approaching it, is the next chapter of a story whose real first chapter, the official explanation of why the show ended, has always been designed to obscure. The real reason Mountain Monsters was canceled is the reason the investigation continues. And the investigation continues because the men who built it know what it was getting close to. Mountain Monsters ran for 8 seasons on Destination America and Travel Channel. The Ames team, Trapper, Buck, Huckleberry, Jeffro, Willie, and Wild Bill, became some of the most beloved personalities in paranormal television history. Then Trapper died. And what happened to the rest of the team in the years since? The grief, the struggles, the financial realities, and the personal costs of a show whose end left 6 men without the framework that had defined their lives, is the story nobody has fully told. Subscribe and stay until the very end. Mountain Monsters was never really about monsters. The creatures, the Mothman, the Grafton Monster, the Wood Booger, the Shadow Creature, were the premise around which the show organized its investigations. But what the audience came back for season after season was not the creature hunt, it was the men conducting it. The Ames team, the Appalachian investigators of mysterious sightings, represented something that paranormal television had never previously produced in quite the same form. Not a group of scientific researchers applying methodological frameworks to anomalous evidence. Not a team of professional investigators whose credentials gave their findings institutional credibility. A family. 6 men from the Appalachian region whose relationships to each other preceded the show and whose collective personality, the humor, the loyalty, the specific quality of warmth that the mountain communities they came from produces in the people it shapes, gave the production something that no casting process or production format could manufacture. John Richard Tice, Trapper, was the patriarch of that family in every sense that the word communicates beyond its biological meaning. He was the team's founder, its leader, its moral center, and its most irreplaceable personality. His combination of practical mountain wisdom, deadpan humor, and the specific quality of quiet authority that the people who grew up around men like him recognize immediately gave the show its tone and its soul. At 72 years old, after 8 seasons of leading his team through the mountains of the Appalachian wilderness in pursuit of creatures whose existence the investigation never definitively confirmed, and whose pursuit was always secondary to the experience of watching these men pursue it together, John Richard Tice died of kidney failure on December 16, 2019. He was surrounded by his family. The show had been his. The team had been his, and what the team became in the years after his death, how each of the men who had built their professional and personal identities around the Ames operation navigated the specific grief and the specific dislocation that losing Trapper produced, is the chapter of the Mountain Monsters story that the broadcast record has never told, and that the audience that fell in love with the Ames team across 8 seasons deserves to understand fully. John Richard Tice's death on December 16, 2019 did not simply remove the most beloved personality from a paranormal television production. It removed the organizing center of 6 men's professional and personal lives. The figure whose presence had given the Ames team its identity, its direction, and the specific quality of coherence that the audience experienced as the show's most essential characteristic across 8 seasons of Appalachian creature investigation. The grief that Trapper's death produced in the remaining team members was not the professional loss of colleagues whose working relationship had been organized around a shared employer. It was the grief of men who had lost a father figure, whose relationship to the person who died was built on the kind of sustained, genuine, mutually invested connection that the Appalachian community's culture of loyalty and long-term relationship produces in ways that the outside world does not always fully register. Buck, Jacob Lowe, was the youngest member of the team and the one whose relationship to Trapper had the most explicitly paternal character. He had been the team's most energetic field presence across 8 seasons, his enthusiasm and his physical capability in the Appalachian terrain giving the investigations a momentum that Trapper's leadership directed and shaped. What Trapper's death produced in Jacob Lowe, in a young man whose professional identity had been built in the context of a relationship whose loss removed the framework that identity was organized around, is the chapter of his post-show story, whose specific personal dimension the people who know him have been most careful about in their public communications. Huckleberry, Joseph Lott, whose background as a retired Marine had given the team its security presence and whose quiet, steady reliability had made him one of the most trusted members of the Ames operation, processed Trapper's death with the specific quality of military discipline that his background had built into his response to loss. a composure whose public face has not always reflected the private dimension of what losing the team's patriarch produced in a man whose adult life had been organized around loyalty to the people he served alongside. Jeffro, Willie, and Wild Bill each carried the loss in the specific ways that their individual relationships to Trapper and to the team's collective identity had shaped, and each has navigated the post-show years in the context of that loss in ways whose full accounting the broadcast record of the seasons that followed Trapper's death has not provided. Jacob Lowe, Buck, was handed something when Trapper died that no amount of preparation across 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters had fully equipped him to carry. Not the show's leadership in the institutional sense of a production role whose responsibilities were formally transferred. The weight of being the person the team looked to in the absence of the person they had always looked to. The specific, unasked for, unavoidable weight of being the youngest member of a family-like team who finds himself in the position of the eldest after the eldest is gone. He was in his early 30s when Trapper died. He had spent the preceding years building his professional identity as the Ames team's most energetic field investigator, the caller, the tracker, the physical presence in the Appalachian wilderness whose combination of mountain knowledge and genuine enthusiasm gave the show some of its most compelling investigation moments. He had never been positioned, by the team's dynamic or by the show's production format, as the successor to Trapper's leadership role. The succession was not planned. It was not chosen. It was produced by circumstance in the specific and inescapable way that the death of the irreplaceable always produces succession in the people who remain. What Buck did with that weight in the years following Trapper's death is the chapter of his post-Mountain Monster story whose specific character the Sons of Appalachia YouTube channel, the independent production he launched alongside Huckleberry and Wild Bill after the show's conclusion, partially documents without fully representing. The channel gave the 3 men a platform for continuing the investigation work that Mountain Monsters had organized their lives around, without the production infrastructure that the Travel Channel relationship had provided. It gave Buck a professional context for the leadership that Trapper's death had left without an occupant, and it gave the audience that had followed Mountain Monsters across 8 seasons a way of maintaining their relationship with the team members whose personal appeal had been the show's most fundamental asset. What it did not give Buck, what the Sons of Appalachia channel's independent production format could not replicate, was the institutional support, the production resources, and the audience scale that the Mountain Monsters broadcast relationship had provided. Starting over as an independent content creator at 30-something, carrying the grief of Trapper's death and the weight of the team's expectations, is the specific starting over whose cost the Sons of Appalachia channel's cheerful presentation has never fully represented. When the Mountain Monsters Ames team navigated the specific fracture that Trapper's death and the show's eventual conclusion produced in the collective it had been, the paths its members took in the aftermath were not uniform. Buck, Huckleberry, and Wild Bill chose the Sons of Appalachia path, the independent YouTube channel whose continuation of the investigation format gave their post-show professional lives a direction and a platform. Jeff Headley, Jeffro, and Willie McQuillian made different choices whose specific character reflects both their individual personalities and the specific ways that 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters had intersected with the professional and personal dimensions of their lives outside the production. Jeffro, the team's researcher and technology specialist, the man whose antique shop in West Virginia had given his professional identity a foundation that predated the show and would outlast it, returned to the life that Mountain Monsters had organized around rather than replaced. His antique business, his community connections, the specific satisfactions of a life in the Appalachian region, whose roots go deeper than any television production's tenure, and whose continuity the post-show years have allowed him to return to in a form that the production schedule's demands had consistently interrupted. The return has not been without its complications. 8 seasons of national television exposure changes a person's relationship to their community and to their professional environment in ways that the return to pre-show normalcy does not simply reverse. The audience recognition, the community expectations, and the specific quality of being known in a way that the show created, rather than that the ordinary course of a life in a small Appalachian community produces. All of it shapes the post-show experience in ways that Jeffro's public communications have not fully addressed. Willie McQuillian, the trap builder, the co-founder of the Ames operation, the man whose practical construction skills gave the investigations their physical infrastructure across 8 seasons, returned to the arborist work that had been his professional foundation before the cameras arrived. The physical work, the trees, the specific satisfaction of skilled manual labor whose relationship to the Appalachian landscape he grew up in gave his professional identity a grounding that the television production had never replaced. What the return to that life after 8 seasons of national television exposure costs a man whose personality the audience had come to know and whose ordinariness the show's production had made extraordinary is the question whose answer the post-show years have been writing in the specific terms of what Willie McQuillian's daily life looks like in 2026. Joseph Lott, Huckleberry, and William Neff, Wild Bill, represent the dimension of the mountain monster's post-show story, whose specific character is most directly shaped by the specific quality of loyalty that the Appalachian culture both men came from builds into its people as a foundational value rather than a situational virtue. When Buck needed people to stand beside him in the aftermath of Trapper's death and in the construction of the Sons of Appalachia project that represented the team's continuation in a new form, Huckleberry and Wild Bill were the ones who stood there. Not because the professional calculation made it the obvious choice, the Sons of Appalachia, YouTube channel's independent production format offers a fraction of the resources and the audience reach that the Mountain Monsters broadcast relationship had provided. Because loyalty in the specific Appalachian sense of the word does not make professional calculations. It shows up. Huckleberry's background as a retired Marine, whose 6 years of service had built into his character the specific quality of commitment to the people you serve alongside that military culture produces at its best, made his presence beside Buck in the post-show years the expression of something deeper than professional solidarity. He had stood beside Trapper for 8 seasons. He stood beside Buck after Trapper was gone. The consistency is not accidental. It is the expression of a value whose application to the specific circumstances the post-show years produced was as automatic as it had been during the Mountain Monsters seasons. Wild Bill, William Neff, whose 6 years of Marine Corps service and whose reputation as the team's most skilled tracker gave his Mountain Monsters presence a specific and irreplaceable quality, brought the same loyalty to the Sons of Appalachia project with the practical field expertise that the investigation format required. What both men have absorbed in terms of the personal cost of that loyalty, the professional opportunities that the commitment to the Sons of Appalachia channel has not pursued, the financial realities of an independent content creation operation whose resources are a fraction of what the broadcast relationship provided, and the specific personal dimension of sustaining a professional commitment in the grief-shaped aftermath of Trapper's death is the chapter of their post-show story whose full accounting the Sons of Appalachia channel's content has never provided. Mountain Monsters ran for 8 seasons on Destination America and Travel Channel and produced an audience whose loyalty and whose size gave the franchise a commercial value that the network's investment in its continued production across multiple seasons reflected. What it paid the men whose personalities generated that commercial value is the chapter of the show's history that the broadcast format's entertainment presentation has never addressed, and that the post-show financial realities of the Ames team's individual members communicate in the indirect but legible terms of what their lives look like in 2026. Reality television has a documented and well-understood history of distributing the commercial value that its cast members generate in ways that the disproportion between the network's profit margins and the cast's compensation makes visible to anyone who looks at the cast members' post-show financial situations against the backdrop of the show's commercial success. Mountain Monsters was not a show whose cast members' compensation reflected the audience loyalty and the commercial value that their personalities created. The production was regional in its talent base, drawing from the Appalachian community rather than from the entertainment industry's professional talent pool. And the compensation structures that regional reality television applies to cast members whose marketability outside the specific production context is limited by the regional and cultural specificity of their appeal are not the compensation structures that nationally recognized entertainment talent commands. The Ames team members were not nationally recognized entertainment talent in the commercial sense that drives compensation negotiation. They were genuine personalities from genuine backgrounds whose authenticity was the source of their appeal and whose marketability outside the Mountain Monsters context. The network's compensation assessment reflected in terms that the show's commercial success did not proportionally represent. What that means for the financial realities of each team member's life in 2026, the specific economic foundation on which the post-show years have been built, is the dimension of the tragic story this video documents that the show's adventure presentation was most completely designed to not address. The Mountain Monsters broadcast record after Trapper's death, the seasons that continued without him, organized around the team's attempt to maintain the investigation operation that his leadership had built, is a document of grief that the show's entertainment format was not designed to represent honestly, and that the production's obligation to maintain the audience relationship the prior seasons had built did not allow to be represented fully. The team went back into the Appalachian Mountains after Trapper died. They went back with the cameras and the production infrastructure and the creature hunt format that his leadership had established. They went back because the show was the thing he had built, and continuing it was the most direct expression available to them of the loyalty they had built around him across 8 seasons of shared experience. What going back without him cost each of them, the specific experience of conducting the investigations that his presence had always defined in the absence of the presence that had defined them, is the dimension of the post-Trapper seasons whose complete accounting the broadcast record has never provided. The humor was still there in those seasons. The warmth was still there. The specific quality of the Ames team's collective personality that the audience had built its loyalty around was present in the men who continued after Trapper's death in a way that reflected both the genuine resilience of the Appalachian character the show had always celebrated and the genuine effort those men made to honor what he had built by continuing to build it in his absence. What the humor and the warmth were covering, the specific grief that sustained loss of the kind Trapper's death produced, does to the people who carry it across the years of daily life in its aftermath, is the chapter that the post-show years have been writing in the private dimensions of each team member's experience, and that the Sons of Appalachia channel's continuation of the adventure presentation has not been designed to address. Grief of this specific kind, the grief of losing the person whose presence organized the context in which your most significant professional and personal relationships existed, does not resolve on a timeline that the 2026 versions of Buck, Huckleberry, and Wild Bill have fully completed. They are still in it, and the work of continuing. The Sons of Appalachia channel, the investigation format, the Appalachian creature hunt, is the work of men who are doing the most meaningful thing available to them with the grief they are carrying, which is to keep doing what Trapper built in the mountains he loved, with the team he made. In 2026, the members of the Mountain Monsters Ames team are in the specific chapter of their post-show lives, whose character the accumulated weight of everything the preceding parts of this video have established: the grief, the financial realities, the professional dislocation, the personal costs of 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters, followed by Trapper's death, followed by the show's conclusion, has shaped in ways that the straightforward adventure narrative of the broadcast record never prepared anyone to understand. Buck is in his mid-30s. Leading the Sons of Appalachia operation with the specific combination of genuine commitment and personal weight that the years since Trapper's death have built into his leadership. The channel produces content whose quality and whose audience loyalty reflect the genuine personality that made him one of Mountain Monsters' most compelling cast members. What it does not produce, what the independent content creation format cannot provide in the absence of the broadcast relationship's resources, is the institutional infrastructure that the Mountain Monsters production gave the investigation work, a foundation it has not had since the show concluded. Huckleberry and Wild Bill are beside him in the Sons of Appalachia operation with the loyalty that their individual characters and their shared history with the team have always produced. Their presence in the post-show continuation is the most direct expression available of what the Ames team was always about. Men from the Appalachian Mountains who show up for each other because showing up is what the culture they came from built into them as the most fundamental obligation of relationship. Jeffro and Willie are in the lives that Mountain Monsters organized around rather than replaced. The antique business, the arborist work, the Appalachian community roots whose depth the show's 8 seasons did not exhaust and whose continuity the post-show years have allowed them to return to. Their starting over is the quieter kind, the return to what was always there rather than the construction of something new. And all of them, every member of the Ames team in 2026, are living in the specific aftermath of Trapper's absence, whose complete accounting no broadcast episode and no YouTube channel and no public communication has yet fully provided. Mountain Monsters was never really about monsters. The audience that followed 8 seasons of the Ames team through the Appalachian wilderness understood that without always being able to articulate it precisely, understood that what they were watching was not primarily an investigation of cryptid phenomenon, but a portrait of a specific kind of human community whose values and whose relationships the show celebrated in the specific setting of the American mountains. The creatures were the occasion. The men were the subject, and what the men's lives in 2026 communicate about what the show was, about what 8 seasons of Mountain Monsters built in the people who made it, and what its conclusion and Trapper's death have asked those people to carry in the years since, is the completion of the portrait that the broadcast record began without finishing. The tragedy of the Mountain Monsters story in 2026 is not catastrophic in the dramatic sense of public failure or acute crisis. It is the quieter and more lasting tragedy of men whose most significant shared experience ended before they were ready for it to end, whose patriarch died before any of them had fully processed what his leadership had meant to who they were, and who have been navigating the aftermath, the grief, the financial realities, the professional dislocation, the personal costs, with the specific combination of resilience and loyalty that the Appalachian culture they came from built into them as the most fundamental qualities a person can possess. Trapper built something real, not a television show, a team, a community of men whose relationships to each other and to the mountains they investigated together were genuine before the cameras arrived and remained genuine after they left. What those men are doing in 2026 with what Trapper built is the most honest continuation available to them. They are in the mountains. They are together. They are still looking. And the man who taught them to look, whose presence in those mountains gave everything they found there its meaning, is gone in the specific way that irreplaceable people are gone, present in everything his team does, absent from all of it. The story is tragic because it is true, and it is worth telling because the men it is about deserve to have what they have carried understood by the audience that fell in love with them across 8 seasons of Appalachian creature investigation. This is what Mountain Monsters looks like in 2026, and it looks like men who loved their leader keeping faith with what he built. In September 2014, the Mountain Monsters crew filmed an episode in Wirt County, West Virginia, investigating reports of the Yahoo cryptid that would never air on Destination America. Subscribe now because what the cameras captured during that investigation was so dangerous, so controversial, and so disturbing that network executives banned the episode immediately, ordered all footage locked away, and threatened legal action against anyone who discussed what happened. For 9 years, the episode remained hidden until leaked footage surfaced online in 2023. This is what really happened during the banned Mountain Monsters episode that the network desperately tried to keep secret. Mountain Monsters premiered on Destination America in 2013, following a team of Appalachian hunters and trappers known as the Appalachian Investigators of Mysterious Sightings, or AIMS team, as they tracked cryptids throughout the mountain regions of West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, and surrounding states. The show featured team leader John Trapper Tice, along with investigators Jeff Headley, William Wild Bill Neff, Joseph Huckleberry Lott, Jacob Buck Lowe, and Willie McQuillian. The format combined cryptid investigation with trap building, following the team as they interviewed witnesses, searched remote wilderness areas, and constructed elaborate traps attempting to capture creatures including Bigfoot variants, the Mothman, lizard demons, and other Appalachian cryptids. By Season 2 in 2014, the show had developed a successful formula and dedicated following, leading producers to become increasingly ambitious about the creatures they would investigate and the risks the team would take during filming. In late summer 2014, producers planned an episode focusing on the Yahoo, a violent Bigfoot-like creature reported in Wirt County, West Virginia, with a reputation for being far more aggressive than typical Bigfoot encounters. Local legends described the Yahoo not as a shy forest dweller, but as a territorial predator that had allegedly attacked humans, killed livestock brutally, and defended its territory with extreme violence. Multiple witnesses had reported encounters where the Yahoo charged at people rather than fleeing, threw rocks with deadly accuracy, and made terrifying vocalizations that sounded like screaming combined with growling. The AIMS team had investigated aggressive cryptids before, but the Yahoo reports suggested something genuinely dangerous rather than just frightening. Producers were aware of the risks, but believed the team's experience and the dramatic footage potential official justified proceeding with the investigation. The plan was to conduct a week-long investigation in the remote Wirt County wilderness, build a large trap designed to contain something extremely strong and violent, and attempt to capture evidence of the Yahoo through nighttime tracking and provocation. What producers didn't anticipate was how quickly the situation would spiral completely out of control, resulting in injuries, production equipment destruction, and footage so disturbing that network legal teams would determine it could never be broadcast. The investigation began in early September 2014, with the team arriving in Wirt County and setting up base camp in an area where Yahoo sightings had been concentrated. Local witnesses warned them that the creature was not like other cryptids they had investigated, that it was genuinely dangerous and had put people in the hospital with injuries from thrown rocks and physical attacks. Trapper dismissed the warnings as exaggeration, confident the team's experience would keep them safe. On the second night of filming, the Ames team conducted a nighttime investigation in dense forest approximately 2 miles from their base camp, spreading out in pairs with night vision cameras to cover more ground and increase chances of encountering the Yahoo. Wild Bill and Buck were investigating a ravine area where witnesses had reported recent activity when something happened that was captured on both their handheld cameras and a static camera that had been positioned overlooking the ravine. The footage, which would later become the primary reason the episode was banned, shows Wild Bill and Buck hearing something large moving through brush approximately 50 yards from their position. Following standard protocol, they called out attempting to communicate and provoke response. What happened next occurred with shocking speed. A large dark figure emerged from the tree line and charged directly toward Wild Bill and Buck, covering the distance in seconds while both men were scrambling backward trying to retreat. The night vision footage clearly shows both investigators falling as they tried to run, with Wild Bill hitting the ground hard. The figure reached Wild Bill's position while he was down. What the camera captured next was Wild Bill screaming in pain and terror while something off-camera was attacking him. Buck's camera shows him trying to reach Wild Bill but being unable to get close because of the figure that appears to be striking or grabbing Wild Bill repeatedly. The attack lasted approximately 15 seconds before the figure retreated back into darkness. When Buck finally reached Wild Bill, the cameras captured Wild Bill bleeding from multiple injuries, barely conscious, and in severe distress. The footage shows Buck calling frantically for help over radio, trying to assess Wild Bill's injuries while also watching the darkness in case the creature returned. Wild Bill had deep lacerations on his arms and torso that were bleeding heavily, later determined to be consistent with being struck by something with tremendous force or possibly clawed. He had a head injury where he had been knocked to the ground, and he was going into shock from the trauma and blood loss. The rest of the team reached their location within 10 minutes, bringing first aid supplies and helping to stabilize Wild Bill enough to move him. The decision was made to evacuate him immediately to the nearest hospital, rather than waiting for emergency services to navigate the remote location. The cameras captured the chaotic evacuation through dark forest, with Wild Bill being half-carried by team members, while everyone watched the darkness expecting another attack at any moment. This footage alone, showing a clear, violent attack on an investigator resulting in serious injuries, was enough to make network executives extremely nervous about airing the episode, but it was only the beginning of what would make the episode unbroadcastable. Wild Bill was transported to Camden Clark Medical Center approximately 45 minutes from the investigation site, arriving in the emergency department around 2 in the morning with injuries that required immediate treatment and raised serious questions among medical staff about what could have caused such trauma. The medical documentation, which later became part of the legal controversy around the episode, showed Wild Bill had sustained 4 deep lacerations on his left forearm, ranging from 4 to 7 inches in length, 2 lacerations on his right shoulder and upper chest, significant bruising across his torso consistent with blunt force trauma, a concussion from the head impact when he fell, and was treated for shock and blood loss. The lacerations required over 40 stitches total to close. Most significantly for the controversy that would follow, the attending physician documented that the wound patterns were unusual and didn't match typical injuries from falls, animal attacks, or accidental trauma from branches or rocks. The lacerations showed characteristics of being caused by something striking with considerable force in a downward motion, creating tears in the skin rather than clean cuts or typical claw marks. This documentation would later become crucial when network lawyers were determining whether the show could be held liable for putting cast members in situations that resulted in serious injury. While Wild Bill was being treated, production supervisors were having emergency discussions about whether to continue filming or shut down the investigation immediately. The standard practice for reality television when cast members are injured is to halt production, conduct safety reviews, and only resume if conditions can be made safe. However, the remaining Ames team members, particularly Trapper, insisted they needed to continue the investigation to document what had attacked Wild Bill and to prove they hadn't fabricated the incident. This created tension between the production team and network executives who were being updated about the situation in real time. The decision was made to pause filming for 24 hours while Wild Bill was evaluated, and while producers assessed whether continuing was safe and legally defensible. During this pause, something happened that would make the episode even more controversial and contribute to it being banned. Several team members, including Buck, who had witnessed the attack firsthand, began questioning whether they should continue putting themselves at risk for a television show. Buck expressed concerns on camera during interviews that what they encountered wasn't just an animal or even a typical cryptid, but something that appeared to be hunting them specifically and targeting them with intelligence and malicious intent. He stated he believed they had provoked something that was now actively trying to hurt or kill them, and that continuing the investigation would lead to someone being seriously injured or killed. Despite Wild Bill's hospitalization and Buck's serious concerns about safety, Trapper made the decision that the team would continue the investigation after the 24-hour pause, arguing that walking away would mean the attack on Wild Bill had been for nothing, and that they had an obligation to document what was in those woods. This decision created the first major conflict in Mountain Monsters history between team members, captured on camera in footage that network executives later determined could not be aired because it showed how production was prioritizing dramatic television over cast safety. The footage shows Buck and Trapper having a heated argument where Buck explicitly states he believes continuing is reckless and potentially fatal, while Trapper insists they can take additional precautions and that they owe it to Wild Bill to finish what they started. Buck ultimately agreed to continue but stated on camera that he was doing so against his better judgment and that if anyone else got hurt, the responsibility would fall on Trapper and the producers who were allowing this to continue. Production made several safety modifications for the continuation of filming. Additional crew members were brought in to maintain visual contact between team members at all times. Medical personnel were on standby closer to the investigation site. Team members were equipped with air horns and other deterrent devices, and critically, team members were authorized to carry firearms for self-defense, something that had not been done on previous Mountain Monsters investigations. This last modification would prove to be the most controversial aspect of the entire episode, and a primary reason it could never be broadcast. On the third night after Wild Bill's attack, the team returned to the investigation area with modified protocols and additional safety measures. The plan was to set up a large trap structure designed to contain something extremely strong, then conduct nighttime surveillance and tracking to document the Yahoo's behavior and potentially lure it toward the trap. Trapper, Buck, Huckleberry, and Jeff participated in this phase, while Willie remained at base camp monitoring communications. What happened during this third night created footage that was so problematic from legal, ethical, and broadcast standards perspectives that network executives immediately ordered all footage seized and locked away. The team had been working on the trap construction for several hours when they began hearing vocalizations from multiple directions surrounding their position. The sounds were described as howling mixed with screaming, coming from at least 3 different locations in a pattern that suggested coordination rather than random animal sounds. Trapper made the decision to split the team into pairs to investigate the different sound sources, hoping to triangulate the Yahoo's location. This decision, made against the safety protocols that had been established after Wild Bill's injury, put team members in vulnerable positions separated from each other in darkness, while something that had already demonstrated violent intent was in the area. Approximately 20 minutes after the team split up to investigate the surrounding vocalizations, a gunshot rang out in the darkness, captured on multiple cameras from different positions and creating a moment that would define why this episode could never be broadcast. The audio from multiple sources clearly captured a single gunshot followed immediately by Buck's voice screaming for everyone to get to his location immediately. The footage shows team members running through dark forest toward Buck's position, with cameras capturing the chaos and fear as everyone tried to navigate through dense woods while not knowing what had happened or whether there was ongoing danger. When cameras reached Buck's location, the footage shows him standing over something on the ground with his rifle still raised, clearly in shock, and Jeff arriving moments later asking what happened. The footage, which has been described by people who have seen it, but which has never been publicly released, apparently shows a large, dark figure lying motionless on the ground, approximately 10 feet from Buck's position. Buck's account, captured on camera in the immediate aftermath, states that he was investigating the vocalizations when the figure charged at him from close range, giving him only seconds to react. He states he feared for his life based on what had happened to Wild Bill and fired one shot at center mass to stop the charge. The figure went down immediately and did not move. The footage from the next several minutes is reportedly the most controversial in the entire episode, showing the team's reaction as they approached the figure to determine what Buck had shot. Multiple cameras captured the scene from different angles as team members used flashlights to examine what was on the ground. According to descriptions from people who have seen the unaired footage, what the cameras revealed was not clearly a known animal, not clearly a person in a costume, but something ambiguous enough that it created massive legal and ethical problems for the network. If Buck had shot an unknown animal, that would create wildlife law violations and potential criminal charges. If he had shot what appeared to be a person, even if that person was in a costume and charging at him, that would create potential manslaughter or assault charges. If he had shot an actual cryptid, that would raise questions about why the body wasn't preserved and turned over to scientific authorities. The ambiguity of what was actually shown on camera made the footage impossible to broadcast without creating catastrophic liability for everyone involved. The production team made the decision to shut down filming immediately and secure the scene. Local authorities were not initially contacted, a decision that would later become extremely controversial. Instead, production supervisors contacted network executives and legal teams who began emergency consultations about what to do with the footage and how to handle the situation. In the 72 hours following the shooting incident, Destination America network executives, production company lawyers, and crisis management consultants engaged in intensive damage control to prevent the Mountain Monsters episode from becoming a public relations disaster and potential legal catastrophe. The first action taken was securing all footage from the investigation under lock and key, with explicit orders that no copies were to be made and no footage was to be reviewed without legal counsel present. All crew members present during the investigation, including the Ames team members and production staff, were required to sign expanded non-disclosure agreements with severe financial penalties for discussing what had occurred during filming. These NDAs reportedly included liquidated damages clauses in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per violation, effectively silencing everyone involved through the threat of financial ruin if they spoke publicly about the banned episode. Wild Bill, who was still recovering from his injuries in the hospital, was visited by network representatives who secured his signature on similar agreements and reportedly offered financial compensation beyond his standard appearance fees in exchange for his cooperation in keeping the incident confidential. The question of what to do about the shooting itself and whether to involve law enforcement created intense internal debate. Legal counsel advised that if what Buck shot was an animal, West Virginia wildlife laws would require reporting the incident and likely result in criminal charges for hunting violations given that the shooting occurred at night, potentially involved an endangered or protected species if it was determined to be an unknown primate, and occurred in an area where hunting may not have been permitted. If what Buck shot appeared to be a person, or could be interpreted as a person in a costume, failure to report the shooting could constitute obstruction of justice or accessory after the fact to a potential crime. The decision was ultimately made to not involve local law enforcement based on the argument that the figure had charged at Buck in what was determined to be legitimate self-defense, that no body could be located when the area was searched the following day during daylight hours, suggesting whatever was shot had retreated and survived the encounter, and that involving authorities would inevitably lead to public disclosure of the footage, which would create the exact liability exposure the network was trying to avoid. This decision, while legally questionable, was based on risk assessment that the potential consequences of reporting were worse than the potential consequences of not reporting. To justify the decision not to report, extensive searches were conducted of the area where the shooting occurred, documented through photographs and video that would serve as evidence that the network had acted reasonably in determining no crime had occurred. These searches found no body, no blood trail, and no physical evidence that anything had been shot and killed. Network executives and legal teams identified multiple independent reasons why the banned Mountain Monsters episode could not be aired under any circumstances, creating a situation where the footage became permanently locked away rather than simply delayed or edited for content. The primary legal concern involved liability for Wild Bill's injuries and the question of whether the network had exercised adequate duty of care in protecting cast members from foreseeable harm. Reality television productions have legal obligations to maintain reasonably safe working conditions for participants, and courts have found networks liable when cast members are injured during filming if it can be shown the production created or failed to mitigate unreasonable risks. Wild Bill's injuries were serious enough that if the episode aired showing the circumstances that led to the attack, it could be used as evidence in a potential lawsuit that the production had knowingly put cast members in dangerous situations for entertainment value. Even if Wild Bill chose not to sue, regulatory agencies or insurance companies could potentially take action based on the documented safety failures. The shooting incident created even more severe legal problems. Regardless of what Buck actually shot, the footage showing a cast member discharging a firearm during production raised questions about weapons protocols, safety procedures, and whether the network could be held responsible for whatever consequences resulted. If the shooting was legally justified self-defense, airing the footage could still create public relations disasters and potentially subject Buck to criminal investigation if prosecutors decided to review the case. If the shooting was not justified, airing footage documenting a potential crime would make the network complicit. The ambiguity of what was shown in the footage made it impossible to defend airing the episode from any angle. Beyond the shooting itself, the footage showing team members arguing about safety and expressing concerns about continuing the investigation would directly contradict the network's position that adequate safety measures were in place. Broadcasting Buck's on-camera statement that continuing the investigation was reckless and could lead to someone being killed, followed immediately by footage of the shooting incident, would create devastating evidence of negligence if legal action was taken. The ethical concerns were equally prohibitive. Destination America marketed mountain monsters as entertainment about cryptid hunting, maintaining ambiguity about whether the creatures were real or the show was staged performance. The banned episode's footage was too graphic and too realistic to maintain that ambiguity. If what was shown was real, airing it would be broadcasting actual violence and potential death for entertainment. If what was shown was staged, it would constitute fraud against viewers and potentially violate FCC regulations about disclosure of staged content in unscripted programming. Network standards and practices departments determined the violence shown was too intense for the network's target demographic and time slots regardless of context. For 9 years, the banned Mountain Monsters episode remained locked away with only network executives, legal team members, and participants knowing what the footage contained. The Ames team continued filming subsequent seasons without publicly acknowledging the banned episode, though observers noted format changes after season 2, reducing aggressive cryptid confrontations and increasing safety protocols. Wild Bill recovered from injuries and returned to the show, but was noticeably more cautious and refused to discuss Wirt County when asked by fans. Buck remained with the show but showed less enthusiasm for night investigations and became more vocal about safety concerns during filmed episodes. Then, in March 2023, partial footage from the banned episode appeared on social media platforms and file-sharing sites, uploaded by anonymous sources and spreading rapidly through paranormal investigation communities and Mountain Monsters fan groups before network legal teams could issue takedown notices. The leaked footage was incomplete and lower resolution than broadcast quality, suggesting it had been copied from production files rather than master footage, but showed enough key incidents to confirm years of rumors about why the episode was banned. The leaked material included approximately 8 minutes showing Wild Bill's attack and immediate aftermath with graphic injuries visible. The heated argument between Buck and Trapper about continuing the investigation with Buck explicitly stating someone would be killed. Audio of the gunshot and chaotic response with team members screaming and running through darkness, and brief, unclear footage of something on the ground that viewers debated endlessly. Notably absent from leaked material was any clear view of the figure Buck shot, suggesting whoever leaked the footage either didn't have access to that specific content or deliberately withheld the most legally problematic material. Destination America issued immediate DMCA takedown notices and released a brief statement acknowledging unreleased Mountain Monsters footage had been leaked without authorization, investigating how the breach occurred, but notably did not deny the footage was authentic or address specific content shown. Ames team members did not comment publicly, presumably bound by non-disclosure agreements, though fans noted Wild Bill's social media presence decreased significantly after the leak and Buck deleted his Facebook account entirely.